Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar around Brexit, in particular Brexit. What happens next? I'm delighted to say to taking you through today's presentation is Tim Figures. Tim is Director of Industrial Sectors, Technology and Innovation at Make UK, and is working closely in our policy team with all sort of is the Make UK Brexit lead really. Just before I hand you over to Tim, who's got a short presentation to take you through, just some housekeeping rules. There's quite a few of us on the session, as you'd expect, I guess. So any questions, please fire them through the question box, which you should see in the corner of your screens right now. So any questions at all? I know Tim's online for quite a while today and happy to take questions. So just fire them through there. I should also say that this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of that recording will be made available afterwards. So look, without any further hold up, really, I'll hand you over straight over to Tim.
Thank you very much, Roger, and good afternoon, everyone. It's Tim here. Thanks for joining us for this webinar, where we're just going to talk very quickly about what happens next with Brexit, and then the floor is yours to submit questions. And I'm here till 1 o'clock to respond to them as best we can. So, first of all, as I'm sure you've all seen, and it's now been confirmed by all the necessary parliaments, courts and governments, that at 11 p.m. tomorrow, the 31st of January, the UK will formally withdraw from the European Union. Now, what that means is that our representation in institutions like the European Parliament will end tomorrow night. But in the short term, not much else will change. And that's because we're going to enter an 11-month transitional period, which runs right through until the end of the year, to the 31st of December. And during that period, our ability to trade with the EU, visit the EU, and vice versa will remain exactly the same as it is now. In particular, as you can see on this slide, all EU rules remain in place in the UK. If you've got regulatory approvals for your products, they remain valid both in the UK and the EU. There won't be any new customs procedures to be followed. People can go backwards and forwards between the UK and the EU, and trade with third countries, that's non-EU countries, particularly ones where the EU currently has a free trade agreement in place. So places like Canada or Japan or South Korea should remain unaffected. So please, if you're trading with the EU, you can reassure your EU customers that there won't be any changes from Saturday. And that they can continue to do business with you, and you can continue to do business with them in just the same way as now. Now, we know that when these arrangements change and as big a thing as Brexit takes place, sometimes the authorities don't quite understand what they should and shouldn't be doing. So if you do experience any difficulties in trading, and I hope you don't, and I'm pretty sure that you won't, but if you do, if you find people demanding you fill in forms, pay tariffs, have new regulatory approvals, that sort of a thing, between now and the 31st of December, they shouldn't be doing that. And please, can you let us know, and we will take that up with the relevant authorities both in the UK and the EU to get that resolved. So please, we will look after that for you, but let us know if you experience problems and what the problems are, and then we can look into it and get it sorted for you. However, as you can see from this slide, much bigger changes are on the way from the start of next year. The UK and the EU will start on the 3rd of March to hammer out what our new trading arrangements will be, but there's a very, very short period of time to do something very complex and very novel, and to get it all ratified and implemented. And of course, we don't know yet the precise detail, but whatever happens, I think we can be sure that there will be very significant changes, and there will be barriers to trade with the EU from next year that are not currently in place. So that's something it's very important for everybody to prepare for. And the precise details about precisely what barriers there'll be and how things will work will not be known until very late in the year, maybe as late as early November, but you'll have to implement them from the 1st of January. I appreciate that gives very, very little notice once the precise details are clear. So it's really important that you do as much preparation in advance as possible and then do just the final tweaking towards the end of the year. And it's important to remember that it does remain possible that negotiations will collapse. And if that happens, the UK will leave the transition period at the end of this year without a trade deal in place with the EU. And therefore, our trading relationship would revert to the most basic terms commonly known as WTO rules, and there'd be no preferential trade arrangements in place with the EU. So what do you need to do? Well, I think the most important thing is reassure your customers for now, but don't stop your Brexit preparations. We prepared this very useful report with our partners, the law firm Squire Patton Boggs, last year. And although one or two of the bits of information about timescales and deadlines have been updated now, everything it contains in terms of things to think about remains valid. And it's really worth having another look at this report. We can circulate details again later. You can find it on our website to see the kind of things that you should be thinking about. And we've listed a number of them there. Things like customs procedures, tariff rates, quotas, rules of origin for kind of more complex goods, regulatory approvals, the availability of your workforce in future, but also the mobility of that workforce, in particular if you need to send people to the EU for short-term business visits to perform training or to service equipment or install it. There'll be new rules around all of that. And also thinking about the supply chains you're in, and even if you are fully prepared, are all of the other people in your supply chain that you depend on also prepared? Because if they have missed something and they can't deliver to you, or you deliver parts to them but they can't use them because a supply chain's broken somewhere else, you will feel the impact. And because we won't know exactly what the precise shape of the deal will be until very late in the day, it's important just to think about a range of possible outcomes so that you're prepared for a number of eventualities. And when you know precisely which one will happen, then you know what to do about it. It's going to be an interesting year, and negotiations will be intense, and there'll be a lot of political as well as diplomatic activity going on. We'll try and cut through all of that and explain to you what we think is actually going on and what you need to do. And we'll be keeping you updated throughout the year as negotiations progress. There are a number of very specific ways we can do that. In a minute, Roger will explain how to ask me questions now on this webinar. You can always email us your queries at that email address, brexit@mateuk.org. And we're also going to be doing some more webinars and events during the course of the year on Brexit. The next one during February will be specifically about the rules for business travel and how they are likely to change from next year. But we'll be looking at other aspects of Brexit as well as the year progresses. So that's all from me for now. Roger, back over to you.
Thanks, thanks, Tim. Thanks very much for that. Good whistle-stop tour there. As Tim mentioned, we've got some time allotted for Q&As. I'm sure there's lots of questions there rattling around that you want to sort of put over to Tim. They're starting to come through already. So that question box is in the corner of your screens right now, and feel free to put any questions through to Tim. Tim, if you're okay, if you've got your breath back, I'll just fire away and go through them. There's some which are quite highly specific and others which are a bit more perhaps a bit more general. I'll try and pick off some of the more general ones first. There's a lot of members asking about work permits and business travel in general. Is there any specific guidance or advice that you want to touch on around that subject?
Yes, of course. And I would just say that we are going to be providing a separate webinar on this topic because it's a very complex one during February. So look out for that. as part of the trade deal, the UK and the EU will negotiate. They'll try to put in place easy arrangements for short-term business visits. So that means going for a business meeting, sales, a conference, maybe a day or two to fix a problem. But longer term transfers to work in the EU, I think under any circumstances, are going to require work permits. Those are done at the level of the member state, and so they're going to be different depending on which member state you want to go and work in. And unfortunately, if you want to go and work in a number, then you would need to engage with each of those rather than there being a single one that would apply for the whole of the EU. Just as far as short-term business travel is concerned, it's unlikely that a visa or a permit would be required for that, but there will be restrictions, particularly in terms of the number of days at any one time and the number of days in any one year that you can go as a short-term business visitor. And just like when we go to non-EU countries now, I think we can expect the European border authorities to be more questioning about why people are travelling to the EU than they currently are, and we'd need to be prepared to provide evidence about the purpose of visits and to answer questions about that.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Tim. Thanks for that. Just okay. The questions are definitely coming through thick and fast now, which is a very good sign. Okay, so how likely is it that the trade agreement can be agreed in the next 10 months? And also, Tim, is there any risk of crashing out at any time during the transition before 31st of December?
So there's no risk of crashing out before the 31st of December. The transition period is agreed. The UK and the EU have signed up to it, and it will definitely run until the end of the year. So there will be no change, guarantee you, between now and the 31st of December. Quite how long the transition period lasts, though, is already becoming a kind of matter of negotiation. The UK and EU have agreed it's actually possible to extend the transition period for a further 2 years, but that decision would have to be taken by the 1st of July this year, 2020. The EU is saying that to negotiate the kind of agreement it's got in mind would take longer than 11 months, so they think a longer transitional period would be necessary. But the UK government has set its face against that and been very clear that it's not going to extend the transition period, and it thinks it's possible to get a comprehensive deal done in 11 months. So, clearly we've got the two parties to this negotiation with a very different view about whether 11 months is long enough. Negotiations will start in March in any case, and round about May, both parties will have to take stock as to where they've got to, and there'll be a big meeting between Boris Johnson and the President of the European Commission in June, and that's the point at which we'll have to have a discussion about whether 11 months is long enough, and whether both the sides are going to try and complete in that time, or whether the government, in fact, despite what it said, would ask for a transition period extension. We genuinely don't know how those negotiations will end up, but round about May or early June, we will have clarity on the precise timetable.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. I did mention there's a few quite specific ones. There's one here about environmental accreditations. So like EMAS and ISO, will they, their validity, I guess, will they no longer be valid in the UK? And if so, when would that happen?
So things that are derived from more international standards regimes like ISO or EN standards, I think the intention is those would continue to be valid in the UK, although that's subject to final negotiation. Where I think people will have an issue is if you've got a regulatory approval, so such as a UK body has issued a certificate saying my product conforms to this standard or my product's in line with these regulations. unless the UK and EU continue to agree to continue to recognise those bodies, those approvals will no longer be valid for selling some products like that into the EU, and you'd need to find an EU-based accreditation body to issue the certificate. And that unfortunately means you might end up having to go through two regimes and getting two certificates for exactly the same product, one for selling it in the UK and one for selling it in the EU.
Okay. Cheers, now. Cheers, Tim. Thanks for that. And if you're okay, I'll just keep on going through these questions as they come through. Yeah. Okay. Any news on if TSP will be available from the 1st of Jan 2021?
No, not at the moment. Not at the moment. We don't know.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Someone's asking here about VAT codes. Let me just sort of try and get to the meat of this one. Will we be using the same VAT codes on sales purchase invoices for trades with EU from the 1st of Feb 2020?
Yes, you will from the 1st of Feb 2020, but there may be changes from January 2021 because the VAT treatment will be as per third country exports, where essentially VAT has to be paid and reclaimed.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Okay, this one here about someone's interested on whether it's the employer's responsibility to get evidence of the employee's settled status.
That is a very good question. On that particular one, because I don't want to give wrong legal advice, I think we will have to get back to that particular person, because I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that one.
That's very wise. I should say, if there's anything we can't answer today on the webinar, then obviously we've got the details through the registration process. So any unanswered questions, we'll come back to delegates with a full and thorough answer. No, thanks, Tim. That's fine. Okay, someone's asking about the possibility of requiring invoices for shipment going forward as of tomorrow.
So as of tomorrow, export procedures to the EU should remain the same as they are today. Any changes will come from the 1st of January 2021. So if a customer is saying, I need you to provide paperwork from tomorrow night that you don't need to provide now, that's wrong. They should be able to operate on exactly the same paperwork as you do right now.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Tim. Question from us from June Smith. Can you please advise if it's still okay to travel to the EU in 2020 if you have less than 6 months left on your passport? I think someone might be planning a holiday. So yeah, is it okay to travel if you've got less than 6 months left on your passport in 2020?
Up until the end of 2020. From the 1st of January 2021, you need to have 6 months remaining, and the passport must be no more than 10 years old.
Okay, excellent. Thanks again, Tim. Okay, will Make UK be producing an action plan or guide for manufacturers to use once if FTA is agreed?
Yes, I'm sure we will. As I say, the joint report that I mentioned in the presentation, which we did last autumn, is already out there and available, which explains in more general terms what the things people need to be thinking about, but we'll provide much more specific advice once we have the details ourselves about what's going to happen. I'm sure the government will do that too.
Okay, thanks, Tim again. There was one more, touching on some of the more specific ones, but there was someone asking about any sign of a trade agreement with Malaysia, or would it be an agreement with a group of nations in the Asia Pacific region?
So with Malaysia, it would either be an agreement with the ASEAN group of countries, or the UK is looking at joining something called the CPTPP, which is a broad group of countries in the Asia Pacific region, which includes Malaysia. And so if we decide to join that group, then that's how preferential trading terms with Malaysia will be sorted out. I think it's unlikely there would be a bilateral trade agreement with Malaysia.
Okay, Thanks, Tim. But bear with, there is a sort of in-depth one here on VAT. I was under the impression that the VAT upon entry would not be required and a paper transaction would be made on VAT returns. If this is not the case, how do importers of high-value items meet a potential VAT cash outflow, which would not be covered by a bank guarantee or deferment?
Well, that is an extremely good point. And so, first of all, I'd like to reassure the person that asked that question that there should be no problem from tomorrow night. But working out the VAT arrangements is one of the things that will be in the UK EU FTA and will be pretty complicated. There is the possibility that there will be a cash flow implication for exporters having to pay VAT and reclaim it rather than the current system, which doesn't require you to do that. So that's something to think about and to discuss with your tax experts.
Okay. Thanks again, Tim, for that one. Someone's asking about, do you envisage much of a change in employment background checks, such as right to work checks and so on from EU countries?
Well, for UK nationals going to the EU, if I've understood the question correctly, absolutely. From the 1st of January 2021, these will be very, very different. At the moment, a UK national going to the EU can turn up just as an EU national here with their passport and claim the same right to work as someone from that country. From the start of next year, that won't be the case. Different EU member states have got different arrangements as to exactly what people have to do and what permissions are required, but it will be considerably more onerous than it is now. As far as EU nationals coming to the UK is concerned, we're waiting to understand exactly what the new immigration system that will be implemented from next year will look like. But what the Home Office has said is that they envisage applying the same rules and processes to people coming from the EU to work as they currently do for people from outside the EU. So there is a much higher standard required of the employer to check that that person's got the right permissions and permits to work in the UK and goes much further beyond simply verifying their identity.
Okay, thanks. We'll keep on going. We've still got some questions coming through and some time set aside. Again, keep the questions coming through. Again, if there's anything that sort of we can't answer here, then I know that we're quite happy to take it offline and come back with a more thorough response. Tim, okay, from a trading perspective, do you envisage the UK to join the TPP?
The CPTPP, the UK government has said that's something that it wants to do. There's some questions about how that fits with whatever trading relationship we negotiate with the EU, and so those things will have to be looked at in parallel. But the government has said it wants to join the CPTPP. It's just a question of negotiating the terms and whether the existing members of that agreement are happy to agree the UK joining in.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Okay, there's one here about we are a small company only using a freight forwarder at the moment who's dealing with our exporting paperwork. Do you think there's anything else we should be doing in the meantime before the transition period will end?
Well, I would just make sure that your freight forwarder understands the new rules that will apply for trading with the EU and has the capacity to implement those. And that you think about what the kind of cost and lead time implications will be of having to go through a more cumbersome export process for trading with the EU than you do at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Tim. One here about customs clearance charges. So will customs clearance charges be the same for shipments of £300 as for, and I'm counting my zeros, for £20,000?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I think those charges tend to be decided by the freight forwarder or whatever agent you have doing those things for you. So I think that's a question to ask them.
Okay. All right, thanks, Tim. Okay, I'm just looking through the list of questions. A few which are sort of might require a little bit more in-depth detail and require to be taken offline. I'm just sort of quick scan through here. Okay, perhaps there's another one here. Do you have any insight into the likelihood of the EU Commission granting an adequacy decision to the UK in respect of data protection during the transition period?
That's an extremely good question. So quite apart from the free trade agreement negotiations, the EU and the UK will be trying to get two actually adequacy decisions, one on to do with financial services and the other one to do with data. It's something that's in both sides' interests. Really, the question is, and we don't quite know this yet, what demands the EU will make of the UK in order to get that decision, and whether the UK is willing to meet those. I think the EU is likely to say that the UK needs to stick with the GDPR. As we've all implemented that now, hopefully that won't be too difficult. But we'll see as the negotiations progress exactly where those end up. I think it's quite likely that an adequacy decision will be reached, though, because so much data goes backwards and forwards between the UK and the EU. It really is in the interests of both parties to get that sorted out.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I think we might have sort of touched on this one previously, but what's the role of HR in checking the settlement status? Do we need to put in some measures?
I think that was one of the ones where, rather than give incorrect legal advice over the air, I was going to go back and double check. So I think we will get back to you on that one. I don't want to mislead anybody.
Apologies, Tim. It's obviously a key area of concern. There's a couple of questions that are just around that theme. So for anyone else asking, we'll come back with that.
We'll come back to you on that.
Yeah. Okay. So we own a French registered business. Will there be any restrictions, requirements on UK-owned European companies?
It depends what sector you're in, and it depends on the specific rules in each member state. At the moment, because UK citizens are also EU citizens, we can't be discriminated against in terms of ownership and control of companies. But from the 1st of January next year, it will be possible for member states to say, well, only French people can own this sort of business, or it's got to be majority owned, or a majority of the directors have to be French, for example. Now, the rules are different depending on which country we're talking about and also which sector we're talking about. Manufacturing, generally speaking, tends to be not too restricted. But once you get into services, particularly professional services, things like lawyers, accountants, and that kind of a thing, it becomes much harder for UK nationals to be partners or owners of organisations like that.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I think we're sort of getting through these, and there's just a few more sort of perhaps general ones, which I think you can pick up on the session. Okay, someone's asking, where is the UK in regard to rolling over existing trade deals? Will these rollovers last beyond the transition period, or do they all need to be revisited with a view to the post-transition arrangements?
So they need to be revisited with a view to the post-transition arrangements. Okay. The EU has requested to all third countries that for the next 11 months they treat UK exports just as they do now. We're hopeful that that will be the case, but this is one of these places where it's always possible that somebody might make difficulties or not quite understand what the new rules are. So if you do encounter problems, let us know so we can sort them out. But beyond the end of the year, this will have to be revisited. Now, the UK has managed with some of the third countries, Switzerland is an example, to roll over some aspects of that agreement beyond the end of this year, but not others because they're dependent on the outcome of negotiations between the UK and the EU. I'm sorry that that doesn't give a very granular level of detail in response to that question, but it is very, very complex depending on what it is you want to export and where you want to export it to. But if the person that asked that query wants to email us with more details, then we will be able to give a more precise answer.
Thanks, thanks, Tim. Perhaps one that's more general and more applicable to all of us. When travelling to Europe from the UK, either personally or for work, do we need a different driving licence?
Well, not from tomorrow night. One of the agreements that will have to be sorted out between the UK and the EU is around transport services. Now, it's possible the UK and the EU will continue to recognise each other's driving licences, but if they don't, then you'll require an international driving permit. I'm afraid it's a bit more complicated than that because there are two variations of that permit. One is valid in some member states and the other is valid in others. So, for example, if you were going to drive from the UK to Spain, you need one permit for driving through France and another one for driving through Spain. All of this was set out in quite a lot of detail in the government's no deal preparedness pages. So if you go onto the government's website, it sets out in more detail what you'd need to do if the UK and EU don't reach a transport agreement before the end of the year.
Excellent. Cheers, cheers, Tim. And I might be putting you on the spot with this one here, but someone was asked specifically about the Japan Free Trade Agreement. So can you clarify if the Japan FTA is carried over during the transition period? There was a notice from .gov saying it wasn't in place yet. And this is coming from a manufacturer who imports high value products with a relatively high duty rate.
Well, the EU has asked the Japanese government to roll over the existing terms of that agreement until the end of the year. So we expect that it would remain in place for the next 11 months. The UK has also said what it would like to do is negotiate its own bilateral free trade agreement with Japan and have that in place during 2020. So we'd have to wait and see what that ended up like before knowing what terms would apply from January next year.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Tim. That's much appreciated. I think we're sort of coming through to we've gone through a fair bank of questions there, and we've got just a couple left over, which I think probably require a little bit further sort of information, and we can happy to take offline. So unless there's anything else from yourself, Tim, I don't know if you wanted to sort of do a recap or summary of anything that you covered today.
Yeah, well, yes, I absolutely will do. So I think just in terms of the top level messages, first of all, thank you everybody for joining, and it's been great to look at your questions. Please, nothing's going to change from tomorrow night. And if anybody makes difficulties about trade or demands new bits of paperwork or this, that, or the other, please reassure them that they're not required, and then get in touch with us so that we can resolve any problems with the appropriate authorities. But please do be prepared for very, very significant change from January next year, and for the precise details of that change only to be known very much later on during 2020. I appreciate that makes it difficult to prepare when you don't know precisely what it is you're preparing for, and what you have to do will be different depending on what products you're making and where you are sending them to. But do go back to our report with Squire Patton Boggs, which gives you very useful information under all of the key headings to think about, and we will be here to help you during the year and keep you updated as things become clearer.
Thanks, thanks, Tim. I'll just for confirmation, a copy of that report will go out to everyone who registered onto this webinar, so you'll automatically receive a copy of that. The email address is still up on the screens now, brexit@makeuk.org, for any further questions. Any questions that you've submitted today during the webinar that you've put through that question box, if there's any that are unanswered at all, we'll come back to you after this webinar with a more fuller answer. And that just leaves me left to say thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Tim for your time today, and it's very brave of you to put yourself on the spot and open yourself up to those questions really. So that's very much appreciated, and we look forward to hearing from you in further webinars in the future. Thank you.